All right, good morning, afternoon, or evening. This week in our unit on Latin American social movements, we're turning our attention to the Zapatista movement. But before we jump into some context for the movement, here is your do now. Go ahead and respond to the following questions in 2 to 3 sentences. Write a definition of historical context, as we discussed in the last screencast, and explain why is historical context important to understand when studying history. All right, to provide a little refresher, historical context is the social, political, religious, and economic conditions that existed during a particular historical time period. And it's important because it helps us understand the motivations for the actions that people took at a particular point in time and the beliefs that they held. It also gives us a better understanding of factors influencing historical documents. And to really understand the issues that fueled the Zapatista movement, we need to understand historical context and what was happening at the time that led to the creation of the group. So that's why we're focusing on that to begin with. All right, so our central historical question for the day is what issues fueled Zapatista activism? And our objective is to close read 2 documents to identify issues fueling Zapatista activism. Here's our little agenda. Again, I'll give you some background in a short lecture, and then you will close read 2 documents. All right. To situate where this activism is, the Zapatista movement officially started in 1993. And again, if we're looking at issues that kind of fueled their activism, the movement grew out in large part as a result of economic inequality and racial and ethnic injustice. All right, so Chiapas is home to the Zapatistas, but before I introduce you to the Zapatistas, you need to understand the history of their state and the context of the state. Chiapas is a state in southern Mexico that borders Guatemala. In 1519, Cortés colonized the area, which was occupied then by the Aztecs and the Maya, and the area was colonized for 500 years. Over time, more than half of the Mayan population was killed by disease and in conflict, and indigenous populations experienced extreme discrimination, repression, and attempts to make them conform to Spanish culture. Eventually, Chiapas, the state in southern Mexico, became an independent Mexican state in 1824, and that was after the Chiapas declared independence from Spanish colonial rule. Fast forward many, many years after colonization, the state of Chiapas also experienced a really long history of being excluded from important reforms by the Mexican government that would increase the quality of life for those living in the state. And Chiapas, or those folks who are from the state of Chiapas, they make up the majority of the Zapatista movement. Chiapas has one of the highest percentages of indigenous populations in all of Mexico. And it's important to pay attention to kind of how race and ethnicity are bound up in the history of Chiapas, first through the process of colonization, and then through the interactions between the Mexican government and Chiapas. And that state was, again, historically written out of a lot of laws, and as a result, kind of experienced extreme poverty. All right, so who are the Zapatistas? Well, after a lot of peaceful movements for land reform in the 1960s and 70s by indigenous populations in Chiapas, they were largely met with kind of government indifference and increased repression from landholders. So as a result, a lot of indigenous villagers started feeling that armed struggles and the formation of a rebellion group was their only viable path towards a better future. In November of 1983, many Chiapas indigenous folks founded, the Zapatistas as a small guerrilla group. And the founders named the group after Emiliano Zapata, who's a hero of the Mexican Revolution. So the Zapatistas are made up of 2 groups. The first are armed members of the Zapatista Liberation Army, and these are also known as the ELZN. And they take part in regular protests against the government, which have historically turned violent. Other members of the Zapatistas are unarmed Chiapas, and they want to identify as part of the movement, but they don't take part in the armed protests. That's the picture on the right. They show their support for the efforts to improve the treatment of Mexican indigenous peoples. And many of these Zapatista members actually have families and are advocating for basic rights for education and equal land and healthcare access. These folks also protest the government's historic treatment of the group by wearing a mask. So you'll see in both photos, the Chiapas are wearing masks. Zapatistas wear masks as a sign of membership of the movement, and the masks basically symbolize the idea that the government has stripped them of their identities by depriving them of basic rights and made them a quote-unquote faceless people. So that's why they wear masks. All right, so who is Subcomandante Marcos? Well, he's the unofficial leader of the Zapatista army. Zapatista likes to pride itself on being a very democratic group, but Marcos is kind of the unofficial leader and talking piece of the movement. He's led multiple protests against the Mexican government, starting in the 1990s. And he's also the author of multiple letters and documents on behalf of the Zapatistas, one of which you will read today. All right, so next you're going to stop and read a timeline that's linked in your learning log. You're going to go to document A on the Launchpad. It's linked under, it should be under Wednesday, the 6th. Oh, now that I'm reading this, definitely linked under Tuesday. Whoops, okay. Yeah, so it's linked under Tuesday, and you're going to go and click that document. I want you to take a few minutes to read through the timeline. And as you read, you're going to identify some potential causes or injustices that contributed to the formation of the Zapatistas as a rebel group. So to do this, I want you to pay attention to how one event may have led to another. In history, this is called causation, or the study of the relationship between cause and effect. So you're looking at the events and kind of thinking, which one of these events may have spurred activism among the group? And where can I see that there are potential injustices that may have angered the Zapatistas and driven their activism? And again, I want you to pay attention to events up until 1992. We're going to cover the rest later, so just focus on events up until 1992. All right, thanks for looking through that timeline. So, drawing from the lecture that you've heard so far and the timeline, what are some of the injustices and key events that may have fueled Zapatista activism? So at this point, I just want you to take a couple guesses based on what you have read in the timeline. All right. So here are a few things that have fueled Zapatista activism, and in the rest of this Ed Puzzle, you'll learn about a few more, so you can add to this list. The Zapatistas have been historically excluded from land reforms by the government and have had a long history of exclusion from land reforms. They've been forcibly removed from their land, and they've lacked a lot of basic rights that the rest of the Mexican population have had more easily been able to access. And these include lack of education, healthcare, and labor rights for indigenous Mexicans. Government military action and kind of acts of violence have also fueled Zapatista activism, and changes to the Mexican Constitution to favor government interests, one of which we'll learn more about in a minute. All right, so a huge change to the Mexican Constitution resulted in the North American Free Trade Agreement. So what is NAFTA? Well, the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed by Canada, Mexico, and the US, and it eliminated all tariffs and restrictions between those three countries. And by doing so, it created the largest free trade zone between those countries. In 1991, the Mexican president Salinas revised the Constitution to allow for the private buying and selling of land in preparation for NAFTA. And basically, NAFTA enabled the Mexican government to increase its standing in the global economy by selling land to multinational corporations. So you may be thinking, but Ms. Pearson, NAFTA sounds an awful lot like a result of globalization. You're exactly right. That's a great point. NAFTA signaled the increasing connectedness of the world's major economies. And this is really important because NAFTA globalized trade and enabled really large ranches and multinational corporations to take control over land farmed by indigenous communities. And this drove down prices so that local farmers received less for the amount that they were producing. NAFTA is especially important because it led to extreme resentment among the Zapatistas. They felt that the newest president, like past presidents, was not only leaving them out of land reforms, but was also selling out his own people in order to gain a higher economic standing in the global economy. The Zapatistas felt forgotten by their own government, and they declared war on the Mexican government one day after the signing of the NAFTA treaty. So if we're looking at injustices fueling Zapatista activism, we really need to understand that the Zapatistas' resistance grew out of poverty and a lack of economic opportunity that became more severe as a result of globalization, which was the first trend we discussed last Edpuzzle. All right, so I'm going to show you a short video clip that touches on a few different issues fueling the activism of the Zapatistas. And you'll notice that there's a lot of attention paid to the role of NAFTA in this.
Los indígenas en México eran considerados peor que animales, como si fueran cosas, como si fueran piedras, plantas, algo que puede estar o no estar. Y entonces los indígenas lo que tienen que hacer es luchar por ganarse otra vez un lugar y plantear otra vez el concepto de dignidad, que no es algo que se entienda con la cabeza, sino es algo que se vive, que se muere, es algo que se siente dentro del pecho, dentro del sentimiento del ser humano.
Es que nosotros nunca hemos tenido ese derecho. Libertades de expresión, derechos de organizarnos libremente, derechos de dar el precio de nuestro producto, que al fin y al cabo cuando nosotros producimos, el comprador es el que decide el precio de nuestro producto. Entonces desde ahí nace la explotación. Nos pueden pagar al precio de nuestro producto hasta $1, pero ni siquiera pone en consideración los trabajos, los sacrificios que hicimos en cada, digamos, el kilo o el bulto de nuestro trabajo. Y eso nos costó trabajo, nos costó hambre, nos costó nuestro poco de dinero de invertir allí. Y cuando no produce, cuando no fructifica, cuando no nos beneficia, se beneficia a otro. Y los meros trabajadores se quedan igual con los brazos cruzados, la tierra explotando.
Verdaderamente sentimos el peso y el dolor que sufrimos con nuestra familia, porque hay que ir al campo, hay que ir a lavar la ropa hasta los arroyos donde se pueda alcanzar, porque no tenemos agua potable, no tenemos energía, no tenemos doctores, clínicas, pues estamos completamente desatendidos, no podemos encontrar ninguna ayuda, pues. Así es que por eso también nosotros organizamos a las mujeres que sufren.
La problemática agraria, de salud, de educación, son problemas ancestrales que se viven en las comunidades indígenas y es muy contrastante que Chiapas sea un estado que cuenta con una gran riqueza de recursos naturales como petróleo, café, uranio, hidroeléctricas, y que sus propios habitantes no cuenten y sean favorecidos por estos recursos, ¿no?
All right, so now that you've heard some perspectives from Subcomandante Marcos and some other Zapatistas on their activism, answer the following questions. What were some impacts of NAFTA on indigenous and low-paid workers? And what other injustices sparked activism among the Zapatistas? All right. So now to get an even fuller sense of some of the issues that spurred their activism, I want you to stop and read Marcos's first declaration of the Lacandon jungle. And this is document B, which is linked in the learning log. I want you to close read this document with our central historical question in mind. And that question is, what issues fueled Zapatistas' protests? To answer this question, pay attention to the specific injustices Marcos speaks of and the orders that he gives the Zapatista military. So now you should go navigate to the learning log and click on that document. Again, you do not need to annotate or turn in this document. This is just to help you answer the questions. All right. So in a short answer, please describe from Marcos's letter what issues fueled Zapatista's protests. So that's the first question. And then I want you to make a prediction. So with your answer to the central historical question in mind, what might some of Marcos's goals be for the Zapatista movement? Drawing from document B, name 2 to 3 changes Marcos would want to make. All right, so great job today, everyone. Thank you for your work in navigating all these sources. Please reach out with any questions. I'm going to post one more ed puzzle this week so today we kind of covered the Zapatista, the issues fueling the movement and fueling their activism. And next class, we're going to learn about how the Zapatistas have tried to make change and basically better their living situations. So I will post one more screencast this week along with some documents to read. But keep up the great work, and there's a social distance high five for you.